So it's the last day of class. Next week is finals. So we are going to finish chapter 18 today. We're going to talk about diplomacy, a little bit about economics, military interventions, and so on. Before we get started, the final exam is posted in Blackboard. You have until a week from today to turn in the finals. That's the 10th. It's the same format as the midterm, 4 short essay questions, open book, etc., etc. Any questions about the final? Yeah, it's 4 short essay questions, a page to a page and a half. I understand, yeah, open book, all of that, yeah. All right. So we talked about some of the different types of foreign policy last class, security, a bit about economic. So let's touch on diplomacy. Diplomacy is essentially the representation of a government to another government. So our diplomats represent the United States government abroad. They are authorized to speak on behalf of the U.S. government. So obviously you don't want diplomats who are rude, get drunk all the time, misbehave, so on. So with the Foreign Service Act of 1946, we got a formal professional diplomatic corps. If you want to go into diplomacy, you have to pass the Foreign Service exam, and it is notoriously difficult. Most people do not pass the first time around. It also helps if you want to be in diplomacy, if you speak a common foreign language like French, Arabic, or Spanish, because then you can be posted to different countries. But diplomacy is time-consuming. You have to respect the culture of the other country. In countries like Japan, you don't just sit down and negotiate. Maybe you have coffee or tea, discuss other things, and then you get into negotiations. So presidents don't necessarily like diplomacy. It takes time. It takes patience. You have to be willing to sit in a conference room for the better part of a day. And some presidents just don't have the patience to deal with that. They also don't necessarily want the State Department to have power for foreign policy. But diplomacy is necessary. And President George W. Bush, because he didn't use diplomacy, got a lot of criticism for not getting our allies on board with the war, for refusing to explain his rationale, for instead taking the attitude of, you're with me or against me, and if you're against me, get the hell out of my way. Not exactly conducive to people getting on board with your cause. One of the big diplomatic tools that we use is the United Nations. The UN was created at the end of World War II, and its charter was actually signed in San Francisco. So 75 years ago, the UN was created to promote peace and try to prevent another world war. World War I, World War II were very bloody. We're talking millions of deaths, the destruction of cities, famine, and so on. So the UN was created to prevent this from happening again. The UN, though, it doesn't have a standing army, and it doesn't have a lot of power to enforce its own rulings. So it's sometimes criticized as toothless, when the reality is there's just not enough power built into it to really make it effective. And there are two main bodies to the UN. The General Assembly has 192 member states, including the Vatican and the Palestinian territories. The General Assembly meets from September to December every year at the UN headquarters in New York City. This year, of course, it's basically a virtual meeting. You need a 2/3 majority vote to pass a resolution, and each member only gets one vote. So the General Assembly is pretty equal. The vote of the United States does not count for more than the vote of Colombia or Uganda. There's also the Security Council. The Security Council has 15 members, 5 permanent and 10 that are chosen every couple of years and rotate in and out. The 5 permanent members are the United States, the UK, France, China, and Russia. And the Security Council can be called into session at any time. So right after 9/11, there was an emergency meeting of the Security Council. You need 9 out of 15 votes to pass a resolution, but the permanent members have the ability to veto a resolution. And you only need 1 out of 5 vetoes to kill the resolution. So the permanent members will use this for political reasons. China will often veto resolutions on North Korea. Russia will veto resolutions on Syria, and the United States will veto resolutions condemning Israel for building illegal settlements in Palestine. There's also criticism that the UN is too Western-centered. The fact that amongst the permanent members, there's no representation for South America or Africa is not exactly ideal, right? They do get represented on a rotating basis, but we should probably increase the number of permanent members to include at least 1 representative from South America, 1 from Africa, and so on, for better geographic balance. All right. We are also members of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, as it is known. The IMF provides loans to countries as necessary. and the loans are given out in American dollars. So the loan is made in dollars and then converted to the country's currency. And one of the biggest funds ever given was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the IMF gave the former Soviet Union countries $10.5 billion in loans to stabilize their currency. These countries had no economic independence, no currency, no government. So the idea was to at least help them economically while they got back on their feet. They can also help a country rebuild after a war or during an economic crisis like the collapse of an economy. And 2 weeks after 9/11, the IMF gave Pakistan $135 million in loans to help in the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So they knew Pakistan wouldn't be able to help in the fight on their own. So they gave them money to increase security along the shared border with Afghanistan. We also provide about $30 billion every year in weapons and military aid to our various allies. Anyone want to guess which countries get the most military aid from us? No. Most people don't. Israel and Egypt. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Israel because they are our biggest ally in the Middle East, and Egypt because they kind of bridge the gap between Africa and the Middle East because they're sitting kind of strategically, geographically. Yeah. Most people don't, but yeah, Egypt because of its location is the bridge between the Middle East and Africa, so we tend to spend a lot of money there. And we do have the ability to punish countries for bad behavior. We can freeze foreign bank accounts, place trade embargoes, put a travel ban on a leader. For example, we currently have economic sanctions on Iranian oil because of their nuclear program. We have also put sanctions on leaders like Omar al-Bashir, who was a dictator in Sudan up until about a year ago when he was finally overthrown. Bashir has been accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, so we try to punish him for his bad behavior. And sanctions do sometimes work, and sometimes the leaders just don't care. But the idea is at least you break the law, we're going to kind of punish you at least a little bit. All right, we do also engage in collective security. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created in the late 1940s in response to the Soviet Union. And NATO exists to protect the members from military threats. And when NATO takes action, other countries tend to provide the personnel, and the United States tends to provide the money. So in the Persian Gulf War, when NATO pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, other countries provided the personnel, the soldiers, we provided most of the money. Because some of the member states can't afford to provide the weaponry and equipment that their soldiers need, so we help out with that. In a lot of countries, yeah, when there's NATO action abroad, we tend to provide money for that, like removing Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, taking military action in Serbia in the 1990s, things like that. And there's also the ability for NATO to invoke Article 50. Article 50 says an attack on one member is an attack on every member of NATO. So right after 9/11, the other NATO members invoked Article 50 and basically said to us, look, whatever you need to do, we're on board with it. You just tell us what you need. So over 170 countries joined the coalition in the war on terror. The UN basically said, go do whatever you need to do to catch the people who did this. There were high levels of global support for the United States after 9/11. There were very few countries who thought that 9/11 was justified. For the most part, the attitude of the world was, this can't happen, we gotta find a way to stop it. And we have joined other countries in the fight against ISIS because ISIS is a global threat. They've carried out attacks throughout most of Europe. They're not content to sit in Syria or Iraq. They are a global threat. So we do need to take collective action to try and get rid of the threat of ISIS. We are responsible for about a third of the global military expenditures. We spend more on defense than the next 15 countries combined. Part of that is because when there is a crisis, people tend to look to the United States to try and fix the problem. And we will use military action for humanitarian purposes. We are trying to protect the Yazidi, who are under threat from ISIS. The Yazidi are a religious minority. The religion is a mix of Christianity, Islam, and paganism. You have to be born into the religion. You cannot convert. But they are seen as blasphemers. They're seen as unholy by Islamic fundamentalists. So ISIS has committed genocide against the Yazidi, murdering the men and boys and selling the women and girls into sexual slavery. So we've taken action to try and protect the Yazidi from further massacres. But using the military is risky. There's so many external factors we can't necessarily figure out ahead of time. And if we want to try and build democracy somewhere like Iraq, That's going to take years. You can't just walk into a country, overthrow a dictator, say, you're a democracy, good luck, and walk back out again. You got to help build a new government, elections, and so on. So it was anticipated that the war in Iraq would be short because we would defeat the Iraqi army quickly. Now, it didn't take long to overthrow Saddam Hussein. The problem was that Saddam Hussein, as absolutely horrific as he was keeping different factions from being able to fight against each other. So once he was removed from power, all these insurgent groups popped up. All of this infighting, ethnic fighting, religion, and so on. So it's basically turned into a giant headache. And because there's no effective government, ISIS has stepped up into the brink. Now we've got to try and figure out how to create democracy, overthrow terrorist groups, and get people to stop killing each other. That shouldn't be too difficult, right? That's the problem with military intervention. You never know exactly what's going to happen. And the longer a war drags on, the less support there are from the American people. The longer the war in Iraq has been taking, the more criticism there has been of the Bush administration for lying about the weapons of mass destruction, underestimating the costs, and so on. So we've reached a point where most Americans are like, what the hell are we still doing here? Let's just get out while we can. So the longer the action drags on, the less support there is from the American people. And we've been in Afghanistan for like 18 years, so I think people are kind of ready for that to be done as well. There's also some international legal tools to try and help with conflict resolution. Arbitration is very common in conflict resolution. On the international level, when there's two countries or two groups that have a disagreement, they can be referred to a neutral third party, like another country, to help resolve the crisis. So an example of this is the 1981 tribunal that was set up to deal with the illegal seizure of our embassy by Islamic militants in Iran in 1979. People in the embassy were held hostage for over a year, and the embassy was essentially destroyed. So the idea was to get Iran to provide financial compensation for its illegal seizure of U.S. property and its destruction. So Iran eventually agreed to pay the United States for the damage that was done to the embassy. So you'll see arbitration getting used to help with international economic or trade disputes. If we got into a trade dispute with China, the two countries would probably enter into arbitration. And a lot of international contracts contain an arbitration provision, as do domestic. If you ever look closely at the contract for your cell phone or your laptop or so on, there is a provision where you agree to enter into arbitration with the company. Companies like arbitration because it favors businesses. Consumers don't do as well in arbitration. That's why companies write it into the contracts. So if you're ticked off with AT&T, and you try to go after them, you have to go through arbitration, because that's written into your contract with them. Yep, yep. Credit card companies, yeah, they all use it. Credit cards, cable companies, yeah. Same with like labor disputes. If teachers go on strike, it's probably going to be arbitration or mediation that they're going to enter into. Yeah. Yeah, it's very common. So my teacher is actually in conflict resolution, and there's 4 different styles of conflict resolution: mediation, arbitration, facilitation, and negotiation. Most of the time, like for individual disputes, like if you were married and you and your husband were getting divorced, it would be mediation. For businesses, they tend to look at arbitration or negotiation, but usually arbitration. Yeah. 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 Okay. There's also the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ. This was created in 1946 to handle international legal disputes. The ICJ is based in The Hague in the Netherlands. One of the cases that reached a lot of attention was the Democratic Republic of the Congo versus Uganda. In 1998, Rwanda and Uganda invaded the country of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The idea was to overthrow a dictator. Over time, Ugandan soldiers became involved in illegally mining minerals found in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. One of the main minerals that is in our cell phone is found largely in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So Ugandan soldiers were illegally mining these minerals and selling them to international companies. So the DRC sued them and said, knock it the hell off, you're basically stealing from us. And forced them to at least try to stop that behavior. And the United States has been sued by Palestine because we have occasionally supported the building of illegal settlements in what is the Palestinian territory by the Israelis. Palestine is not an officially recognized country. It's basically a recognized territory. But Israel is not supposed to destroy Palestinian communities and replace them with illegal Israeli settlements. Unfortunately, they sometimes do so. And our support of these illegal settlements has gotten us sued by Palestine. They said, look, you gotta stop destroying our country, our territory. So the ICJ, no, sorry. Palestine sued us for that, yeah, because we were supporting illegal settlements by Israel, yes, yeah. So they don't try cases of war crimes or crimes against humanity. They're mostly handling economic disputes, territory disputes. If 2 countries are fighting over who controls a set of islands, then the ICJ will try to determine who has control, things like that. And their decisions are final and binding. So the members of the ICJ agree to abide by their decision. The other main body is the International Criminal Court, or the ICC. The ICC began working in 2002, and it is also based in The Hague. The International Criminal Court is designed to handle war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Prior to this, they would set up tribunals for Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and so on. The idea was to have a permanent court to try these horrific crimes. As a reminder, genocide is defined as the attempt to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So think of the Holocaust, or Cambodia, or Rwanda. Oh, there's multiple ones going on right now. Yeah, no. We'll get into that. Yeah. So they're currently looking into human rights abuses in the Congo, which is what the DRC stands for, Democratic Republic of the Congo. They are investigating leaders in Sudan for genocide being committed in Darfur. Darfur is the western region of Sudan. It's about the size of Texas. And since 2004, about 500,000 people have been killed in a civil war and genocide. The now former president, and I say president in quotes because he was a dictator, would have Sudanese military bomb civilian villages, and then they armed militias to go in and murder, rape, and destroy the villages. And they would rape girls as young as 6 years old in some of these places. So they are looking into some of the leaders for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. They're also looking into the military in Myanmar. The majority of Myanmar is Buddhist, but there is a religious minority Muslim group known as the Rohingya. And the Myanmar military and government has been destroying Rohingya villages, murdering civilians, and forcing them out of the country and into refugee camps where they largely are left to starve. So they're being investigated for that as well. We're not a party to the court, but we do work with them as needed. And the recent and very important decision at the end of 2018 was when a Congolese warlord named Bosco Ntaganda, also called the Terminator, was found guilty of war crimes. And we had the first international conviction for sexual slavery as a war crime, because his soldiers would enslave hundreds of women into sexual slavery. So sexual slavery has finally been recognized as a war crime. And it wasn't until 1998, in a Rwandan trial, that rape was considered an act of genocide. So we're making progress on recognizing sexual violence as a war crime and potentially an act of genocide. So very important decision coming out of the ICC. At one point, the Congo was considered the worst place in the world to be a woman because of mass rape, violence, and horrific harm done to women in the Civil War. Yeah.
Common, like people are just, if somebody see like mass women being raped, like I don't know, like because they live in that country.
It wasn't considered. So this is a fairly recent idea that it is a war crime. I mean, usually it was considered just a side effect of war. Oh yeah, soldiers run rampant, they rape women, whatever. It's just people being people. Kind of like men will be men, which is bullshit, but there you go. They really started to look at it in Rwanda because in the Rwandan genocide, up to 500,000 women were raped in 100 days. So they really wanted to understand how rape is used as an act of war. In Rwanda, it was women from a certain ethnic group who were being raped. So that's why it was considered an act of genocide, because they were deliberately targeting women from this group for gang rape, rape with foreign objects, and so on. Then they started really looking into rape in conflict and understanding that deliberately targeting women for violence should be considered a war crime, right? It's not just men being men, it's deliberately torturing women and inflicting harm upon them. As to why it happens in war, that's a question that's been debated for centuries. I mean, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I'm glad finally there was a nice meal.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, in my dissertation, I looked at the concept of sexual dehumanization and genocide. So, like in Darfur, part of the reason they're raping girls as young as 6 years old is it's a culture of virginity. So, if the girls are raped before marriage, they're considered spoiled goods and they can't get married, so then they can't contribute to their group's reproduction rate. So, part of it's also the culture of you're supposed to be a virgin when you get married, so if we rape the virgins, then yeah. Yeah. Also, sometimes it's a psychological tool against men. In Rwanda, if you're raping a woman in front of her husband or father, then they can't protect the women, and they're seen as failing because they haven't done their job as men to protect the women. So it's a lot of different, yeah. There's a bunch of really weird different reasons why, yeah. But yeah, at one point, Democratic Republic of the Congo was the worst country in the world to be a woman. It's getting better, but it's still not great. Okay. So with foreign policy today, there's this weird clash between the idealism and the reality. Americans like the idea that we're a benevolent force for good, spreading democracy, promoting peace, using force as an absolute last resort. That's not necessarily the case. And we've seen problems with the way we've treated enemy combatants in Iraq and Afghanistan. Torture is illegal under international law. But we have engaged in acts like waterboarding, which is basically simulated drowning, and a practice called extraordinary rendition, where we would basically kidnap suspected enemy combatants and send them to countries like Egypt and Syria that aren't quite so squeamish about torture. Here's the thing though, torture does not work. If someone holds up a knife and says, I'm going to cut off your fingers unless you tell me where the bomb is, you're going to make something up, right? You're not going to want to be tortured. So torture actually doesn't work because people will say anything to end the pain. So torture doesn't actually work, but it still gets used. Most torture today is more psychological. Leaving lights on all night, blaring music so people can't sleep, things like that. But it doesn't square away with our idea of treating people well. But it does happen. It's also true that globalization has made it easier for non-state actors to attack us. All 19 of the hijackers on 9/11 entered the country legally. They came in on work visas or tourist visas. So none of them were there illegally. So we have to remember that. An ISIS member can get a passport, go to Germany, drive a truck into a crowd, and leave again. It's very easy for terrorist groups to recruit people in different countries or to just travel between countries. If you have a member of ISIS who's a German citizen and they go to France, because they're part of the European Union, there's no passport check at the border. They just go straight across. And it's a terrifying thought, but it's the reality, is terrorism is much easier today. So it doesn't take as much effort to get from point A to point B. On the other hand, we are seeing less traditional country versus country warfare. And that's because the world is shrinking. We are very globally interconnected. We're not going to go to war with our trading partners. We're not going to go after a country we rely on for exports. So the biggest threat in the 21st century isn't necessarily another global war. It's not impossible. But what we really need to worry about is terrorism. What happens if a terrorist group is able to weaponize anthrax? Or they're able to hack into computers and change election results, or shut off machines in hospitals, things like that. There's still civil war, but there's less concern about country versus country warfare and more concern about terrorism, terrorist acts, and problems like that. So foreign policy is a very difficult area to nail down. At the end of the Cold War, we weren't necessarily concerned about Islamic terrorism. That had to change pretty quickly after 9/11. So the people who work in foreign policy are always having to think about what's the next challenge going to be? What's the next threat we're facing? How do we counteract this? So it's really difficult to figure out foreign policy. It's complicated, it's messy, and sometimes they just get it wrong. So with foreign policy, there's a lot of gray areas. There's not necessarily always a right or a wrong answer. So it's a really complicated area for people who work in foreign policy. And it can be tricky to figure out what to do in a situation. People look to the United States to solve problems, to fix what's going on abroad. But we can't be everywhere. We can't fix everything. But what happens if we choose not to intervene? What happens if we decide we're going to sit this one out? So I'm going to show you an example of what that looked like. In Rwanda in 1994, Rwanda's in East Africa, is a country the size of Vermont. 1 million people were murdered in 100 days. We're talking 8,000 to 10,000 people every single day. The victims were members of an ethnic group called the Tutsi. Most of the killers were part of an ethnic group known as the Hutu. There had been an ongoing civil war, and then in April of 1994, the president of Rwanda was assassinated. His plane was blown up as he was coming back from a meeting in Tanzania. The Tutsis were blamed for the death of the president, and the very next day they started massacring people in Rwanda. So I'm going to show you a clip from a documentary called Ghosts of Rwanda, which was done 10 years after the genocide, so you can kind of see what we're talking about here.
the UN debated whether to keep a peacekeeping force in Kigali, the extremist Hutu leadership implemented the next phase of its plan: to spread the killing across the nation by exploiting Rwanda's culture of obedience. They told Hutus the Tutsi rebels were foreign invaders bent on turning them into slaves. Their propaganda reminded Hutus that the Tutsis had ruled them for centuries, often treating them with disdain.
Tutsis used to abuse Hutus. For example, if a Tutsi chief wished to stand up from his chair, he would call up a Hutu who would allow his foot to be pierced by the Tutsi's spear as he stood down. My understanding is that Tutsis are not originally from Rwanda. I heard that they might have come from Egypt or somewhere else.
An extremist hate radio station told Hutus to eliminate their Tutsi neighbors.
People changed. One day across the valley, we saw houses burning, and people fleeing from their homes.
A 12-year-old girl named Valentina followed her parents into the Catholic Church in Nyirabuye, where along with more than 5,000 other Tutsis, they waited. It was April the 15th.
'When I was a young girl, my parents thought the church was safe because no one would be killed in the church. When we arrived, I could see the older people were very sad and upset. Everybody was scared, but nobody knew what was going to happen.
The leader of the local community told us that Tutsis had fled to Yahweh and that we to go there and kill them. On the morning of April 15th, we woke up and started walking towards the church. It was like going to the marketplace.
I saw the soldiers coming, and they started shooting and shooting. All we had to defend ourselves were rocks. Then our local governor, the Shumbisi, came in and stood in front of us. The Shumbisi said that everyone should know what they were there for. He said that all those who were there should be killed, that no one should survive. Then they started killing, hacking with their machetes. I kept doing it, and I was hiding under dead people. They didn't kill me because of the blood covering me. They thought they had killed me.
But it was as if we were taken over by Satan. When Satan is using you, you lose your mind. We are not ourselves. You couldn't be normal and you started butchering people for no reason. We've been attacked by the devil.
We stood very late, around 2 a.m. when we were home and came back. One of them stepped on my head. He was shaking me and was looked to see if I was alive. He said, "This thing is dead," and so they left. I lived among the dead for a long time. At night, dogs would come to eat the body. Once a dog was eating someone next to me. I threw something at the dog and he ran away. I hid in a small room. That's where I stayed and slept for 43 days.
As the Tutsi rebel army pushed south towards the capital, they found evidence of massacres in village after village. With the rebels approaching, extremist Hutus unleashed more Interahamwe militias to accelerate the killing. The murdered prime minister had been replaced by Jean Kambanda, who incited followers to repulse the Tutsi rebels and their sympathizers, known as Inkotanyi.
Alright, that's a good place to stop it. Okay, so like I said, we can't intervene everywhere, right? But there's a trade-off, and our choosing not to intervene here led to that. So let me ask you guys this. Do we have an obligation to intervene in other countries if needed?
In the video, I would say yes.
Mhm.
If you have the policy of the future, so you could stop something like that from happening.
Sure.
But like if you were to happen, it's ignoring, like that can happen even more, you know?
Sure.
So I would say yes.
In certain circumstances, maybe, right? Yeah. Part of the reason we didn't intervene was a year before we'd been in Somalia. And then we'd had that helicopter shot down where 18 soldiers were killed and dragged through the streets. So eventually the genocide did end when the rebels were able to overtake the capital. The estimated death toll there was about 1 million. They're still finding some of the mass graves people were dumped into. Some of the churches and places where people were killed, they've actually left the churches as they are with the remains and the possessions and all of that so people can see them as they are, basically can see where people were killed as a reminder to the country not to let this happen again. Have any of you heard of the Rwandan genocide before? No? Okay. There's some really good resources. There's a couple of good movies. Hotel Rwanda, if you may have heard of. Beyond the Gates is one that I recommend. It's fictional, but it's based on the killings, and it's very accurate. It's very hard to watch, but it's very accurate if you kind of want to understand what happened. And there's a book, and the name of the video is Ghosts of Rwanda, and the book I'm going to recommend that if you want to learn more about the genocide, I'll type the title in here. Yeah, the name of the book is long. It's We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families, which is a very vivid title, but Gorovich is a journalist. He spent 4 years in Rwanda after the genocide, and he wrote, in my opinion, what is one of the best non-academic books on the genocide. There's a lot of academic books, but this one is written in a way that is easy to follow and understand. So if you're interested in learning more, I recommend this book. Again, it's not easy to read, but it's very informative. Okay, any other thoughts, questions? So what's the genocide you said you've heard about?
Oh, well, it was, I forgot the name, there was one happening, I think it was, I think you mentioned it was happening in, I want to say, it was, I think it was in Myanmar?
In the Rohingya in Burma.
Yeah, I think it was that one, I just heard about it, and it made my head break, because I heard about, all the rapes, the killings,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
The fact that, like, here in the US, I know a lot of people need to be talking about this, and I remember I was, like, telling people, hey, this is happening, like, you guys should read about it. So I remembered it from that. But I haven't kept up with it, because I've just been busy.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on right now, probably suicide.
Yeah, they're trying to figure, they're looking into it, they're trying to figure out what's going on. So there's the genocide against the Yazidi that's going on right now. Darfur, which, because they've overthrown the dictatorship, may eventually stagger towards peace. The Rohingya, then there's possibly in Ethiopia, there's a chance, there's a conflict there that may turn into a potential genocide. Central African Republic, there were some killings that bordered on genocide. China is committing genocide against the Uyghurs, who are the Muslims. That's the one, that one, yeah. Where they're killing them or forcing them into re-education camps, sterilizing them. That's the one, yep. China's genocide against the Uyghurs. It's really bad, yeah. And genocide is nothing new, but the term genocide didn't actually exist until 1943, when a Polish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin actually coined the term. So the term is actually fairly recent, but of course it's been going on for a very, very long time. Yeah, I know, it's insane. So the final is due a week from today in Blackboard. We'll meet next Thursday. Those of you online, you don't have to be online next Thursday, so I'm just going to show a film about the border situation. We'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll be done for the semester. So if you finish the final early, you can turn it in whenever. Otherwise, just turn it in next Thursday by 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. If you have any questions about it, you can email me or call or text my cell phone. During finals week, there aren't regular office hours, but I should be in my office prior to class, so if you have any last minute questions, you can stop by my office. All right, thank you guys.